People who grew up in one place, they can connect to the place in a very different way than those of us who are replanted to these places. I'm a Jew, and in Moldova at the time, there were a lot of professions that you cannot really go to if you are Jew, or even if you go and study math, there will be a quota, how many Jewish students they will accept into math into the university. All the books were the same. So if you're in 8th grade, either you were in Kishinev, or you were in Moscow, or you were in Siberia, you were studying the same textbook. And that's why it was kind of sometimes funny. You know, when you become a patient, you all of a sudden see a different reality. You know, the suffering and how it impacts people and how fragile we are. I stopped taking this failure as something that is wrong with me.
Welcome to the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast, where we talk to computer scientists who immigrated from their home countries for study or for work or for other reasons. In these oral history interviews, you will find established and renowned computer scientists from across academia and industry narrating their experiences of immigrating from where they grew up to a completely different land, often the US. My name is Indy Gupta, and I'm your host. This is episode 30, an interview with Regina Barzilay, professor at MIT in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department. This is the 4th episode in our 4-episode segment on immigrants from Israel. What's special in today's episode is that our guest, Regina Barzilay, is a double immigrant. She grew up in Moldova, one of the republics of the Soviet Union or USSR, back in the 1980s and 1970s. And we talk about the systematic discrimination against Jewish people that was built into the Soviet system back then. And Regina immigrated first from Moldova to Israel and then immigrated again to the US. You will hear Regina take my questions as a cue and narrate amazing stories from both Moldova and Israel. We also talked to Regina about her surviving breast cancer and how she used it to define a new research program. That's coming up today. You may also enjoy the lead episode of this segment on Israel, that's episode 27, featuring 3 prominent computer scientists originally from Israel and who have been in the US since the 1980s and 1990s. As usual, you can find all episodes and detailed episode guides on our website, csimmigrant.org. Again, that's csimmigrant.org. And you can find us and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and basically wherever you get your podcasts. This episode is structured into acts or chapters. You'll find chapter markers on your audio player, and you can use these to jump between the acts or chapters. I'm delighted to welcome Regina Barzilay to the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast. Regina Barzilay is a professor at MIT in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department, EECS, and she's also a faculty at the MIT Jameel Clinic. She has been at MIT since 2003. Regina's research interests include machine learning models for molecular modeling with applications to drug discovery and clinical AI, and also topics in natural language processing. She's won many awards, and among them are the MacArthur Fellowship, also known as the Genius Grant, which she won in 2017. She was also nominated to the MIT Technology Review TR35 award list. This is given to promising technologists under the age of 35. She's a fellow of the American Association for the Artificial Intelligence, AAAI. She's also won a Microsoft Faculty Fellowship and an ACL Fellowship. More recently, in 2020, she was the first recipient of the $1 million AAAI Squirrel Award for Artificial Intelligence for the Benefit of Humanity. Previously, before becoming a professor at MIT, here is Regina's timeline. She was born around 1970 in Moldova, a small country in Eastern Europe that borders Romania and Ukraine. Her first migration was from Moldova to Israel around 1990 when she was aged around 20. In Israel, she received her BS in 1993 and MS in 1997 from the Ben Gurion University of the Negev. Then she immigrated a second time from Israel to the US in 1997 to do her PhD, which she received from Columbia University in 2003. After that, she did a postdoc at Cornell, and then she joined MIT around 2003, where she has been and is currently a professor. In 2014, Regina was also diagnosed with breast cancer. She's a cancer survivor. After this experience, her research changed dramatically towards topics in health sciences and oncology. We'll talk about that as well in the podcast. Welcome, Regina, to the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast, and thank you for being willing to share your journey with us. We are delighted to have you join us.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here.
So you were born around 1970 in Moldova, a really small nation in East Europe. Moldova, for our listeners, is a small nation that borders Romania and Ukraine. Moldova is ranked 135th in area and 138th in population among about 200 countries in the world. That's a really small country. Back then in the 1980s and 70s and 80s, when Regina was growing up, Moldova was part of the Soviet republics. Regina, what do you remember about Moldova from your very, very early years, very, very early childhood years?
So I was born in Chisinau, which is the capital of Moldavia. I never felt that it was small in territory. I felt it was pretty big. It had beautiful streets, a lot of trees. That's what I remember: trees, buildings, and very sunny. I loved it. I really loved it, and I never realized that it was so small and so remote. And also at the time, Moldavia was part of USSR, so then you are really part of like this very big nation. I remember that it was really kind of funny how being in Moldavia and being part of this big country impacts like even your reading, because we read a lot of stories about snow and the forests with these big trees, but we did have a tiny bit of snow, but it's kind of you're reading about other country, but you're living in this very small place, as we can discover now. But I really love the city where I grew up, and since my family left it, I actually never came back. And I now relive those memories. And sometimes, we didn't have iPhone or pictures. The pictures are really like bad quality. I don't have many pictures of the city. It all lives in my memory. And it's, a memory, a lot of it is a memory of a child or, teenager. And sometimes, I try to look on the web and see how it looks like now. So some parts I can recreate, some parts I cannot recreate. And sometimes it's really hard for me to imagine what is it really a reality and what is only in my memory. There was this world that very few people, have the same experience as I did. And I'm sure there are people who grew up in the same time as I did, but I don't know any of those people since we left.
Yeah. When you were going to school, or middle school or so, what was a typical day like for you?
In contrast to the United States, since very early age, you are supposed to go on your own to school, take your bus, which is not a school bus, just a public transportation. Yeah. I had this uniform, which was a long brown dress with with some black things that you put on top of it. And I was, from very early age, I was, a good student. And this was occupying my mind since the moment that I woke up until I went to sleep. I always loved to study, but I also felt some extra stress of kind of being the best student because I'm a Jew. And in Moldavia at the time, there were a lot of professions that you cannot really go to if you are Jew, or even if you go and study math, there will be a quota, how many Jewish students they will accept into math, into the university. So from very early age, it was it was clear to me that what my parents conveyed, that if I want to be able to choose what I will do after I graduate from school, I really have to excel in my studies. So in one hand, that's what I remember, if I'm not talking about the city, but what I remember about growing up, there was kind of two realities. On one hand, you're part of this big happy country, and there is a communism, and we are all kind of brothers and sisters. But on the other hand, there is also a very clear message that you are different, and if you want to succeed, you have to excel, and you should work really hard because there is nothing else that will help you.
So there is this, it seems like a kind of an anti-quota reservation system. Was that intended only for Jewish peoples, or were there like quotas for different kinds of ethnic groups in there?
So at the time, there were like a Russian population that migrated to Moldova after the Second World War, and there were like native population. And there was some really interesting way how they try to do engineering. For instance, when you're applying to schools, they wanted to select certain number of people who would come from villages versus from the city, and variety of different kind of subgroup analysis. And at different points of the history, different groups maybe had different advantage, but the Jewish group didn't have advantage through that whole time. And this was so funny because when I arrived to Israel, people, the first thing, people would ask where you're from, and I would say I'm from Kishinev. And they immediately asked me about Kishinev pogroms. And I was like, what is Kishinev pogrom? Actually, now if you do a Google search on Kishinev, this will be the first thing that come out. Right. This was these terrible events when, the native population went and slaughtered, a lot of Jewish families for no good reason. It was at the beginning of 20th century. It was actually quite known around the world. It was described, but we didn't know about any of that. And another interesting part about my childhood is like my graduation, that my history exam got cancelled because not only for me, for the whole class, because at the time, there was this change in power, and then everything started coming out about, Stalin, what he did and all these things. So there was no way to do an exam because everything that was written in the books was total lies. And and you don't really process it until you become much older, all these different things. I still remember when Brezhnev died, the teacher brought us, not only our class, the whole school, sat in their corresponding classroom, and they put this funeral, which went like for 10 hours. There is a coffin line somewhere, and there is processions of people going. So we were supposed to sit there and cry with tears for the whole school day. And, it's like, why did we do it? And nobody asked even. Isn't it the most bizarre thing? So when I was sometimes looking back at my childhood, there are all these very weird flashes of thinking how that's even possible. But somehow, you make sense out of it, or just because you grow up in it, it sounds logical, until you leave the system, and then it doesn't sound logical anymore.
So the stories that you, I guess, read about Stalin and Brezhnev in school, at what point of time did you start to realize that some of them were not true? Was it around this time, 1990, when the political realities changed, or was it over a longer period of time?
Well, so I didn't realize it. And, you obviously were extremely, not encouraged to talk or to think this way. You wrote all these essays when we are saying the Communist Party did this or did that, and it's so amazing, and I'm so grateful for my amazing childhood. But in 1987, when, the perestroika started, and then, Moscow kind of started opening up, and then there was a whole flood of literature that came out about, what really happens in Stalin's time, because I had no clue, I studied history there. It was nowhere in the books. And also, your kind of very different view of, what's actually going on, because you were indoctrinated in it since early age, and you are busy going about your life, but you don't ask these questions. And the funniest part that I read 1984 when I was, I think 15 or 14 or 15, and I never connected this book with, the life that we were living in. I kind of saw that this is other societies, it's not us. So many times, going through this, like when I'm now thinking about my childhood, how you can live in a lie, how you can explain to yourself, make sense out of things that don't make sense. Sometimes it really helps me to interpret sometimes the current reality in a different light, and be very skeptical about kind of the stories that is told to us, to have really to try to keep your own interpretation of the events.
I want to ask a little bit about your parents. Did they grow up in the same town that you grew up, or did they move from elsewhere?
So my parents grew up in the same town. Their families came to this town after Second World War. My father actually was born during evacuation. The family evacuated to Siberia, and he was born then they came back after Second World War. And my mom's family also came from, another part. They actually came from Western Ukraine, and they came to Kishinev, and that's where my mom was born, and that's where they grew up.
Yeah, and were either your mom or dad, were they involved in science or engineering?
No, absolutely not. And I would tell you what was expectation of me when I grew up. So I was, I was expected to be an excellent student, but in Kishinev, for somebody of my background, the best type of career that you can imagine. I mean, you can be a teacher, you can be an engineer, but the most important part of life was actually to get married and find the right husband. So that's what I was groomed to be.
So that was communicated to you from a very young age.
Yeah.
As you said, you were a good student, so you were interested. I presume you were interested in a lot of subjects, including science and math subjects. How did your parents react to this high level of interest, but also your really good progress in the classes?
No, my parents always expected me that I would be the top student. There was no other explanation. I had to be the best student, and I did well in all the subjects. Now, in contrast, now my son goes to an amazing school in Boston, and there are so many different opportunities for enrichment. We didn't quite had that. It's whatever you study at school. You have a textbook. There is no internet. Whatever the teacher told you to do, you do it. But I think what really changed my thinking about the world. My parents had really a great library, and I was reading a lot. And again, because my parents were working until 6 or 7 every day, so I would finish my school and come home. So I would do the homeworks, but I also had an opportunity to read. So I was reading a lot because there were not many other things that you can do with yourself. So I really enjoy reading and learn a lot about people and the world, and kind of explore different thoughts, things that you don't see in your daily life.
So speaking of books and language, I want to ask, what languages were taught in school? What languages did you use at home? What languages did you use on the street with your friends? What languages were the books that you read in?
So Moldova had a very interesting history because it was kind of going back from Russia to Romania, and the language, which is called Moldavian language, it's actually Romanian language that Russian made it right in the Cyrillic letters, but it's a Romanian language. And again, at the time that it was part of USSR, it's kind of considered to be more high style if you are speaking Russian, and the Russian schools were better schools. And I was placed into a Russian school, and it had specialization in English, so I was studying English since early age. But of course, you never hear English anywhere else but in class, so it limits how well you can study it. But I was speaking, with my friends and with my family in Russian, but part of my family that actually came from Romania, they spoke Romanian. And my Romanian is extremely rusty because I didn't really practice it for decades.
So you said your mom was from that area, but your dad's family probably spoke Russian.
No. Essentially, my mom came from West Ukraine, and
I see.
So I have Ukrainian family, and my father's family, part of them lived in Romania, part of them lived in Moldova. So that part of the family actually did speak between themselves in Romanian or Moldavian, however you wish to call it. So now it's called Romanian, I think, back to the origins.
And the textbooks that you used in school, especially science and math, physics, chemistry, math, biology, were the textbooks in Russian? Were they in English? What languages were they in?
They were all there was nothing in English. It's like, in the class that you were studying. That's it. All the books were in Russian. And in USSR, actually, all the books were the same. So if you're in 8th grade, either you were in Kishinev, or you were in Moscow, or you were in Siberia, you were studying the same textbook. And that's why it was kind of sometimes funny, because they would describe some landscape or some setting of the problem which was completely unapplicable to the geography where you're located, but you still kind of said, okay, let's go with it.
Yeah, because the USSR is a huge country with a variety of different geographies and with a variety of different topographies.
Tribe, it was built around the Russian population that lived in the central Russia, but then sent to everybody else. And literature that we studied, which I was very lucky, we actually studied only Russian literature, which I greatly enjoyed.
So moving forward in your timeline, in the 1980s, as the USSR era policies are kind of winding down and glasnost and perestroika, which you mentioned earlier, are becoming more the mode, how did those changes affect the daily life of you and your family, and also how did it affect the schooling?
So at the time the mess started in my last year of school, when, on one hand, there was a perestroika and all these changes in how people thought and, kind of this taste of real democracy. But on the other hand, in Moldova, the situation really became terrible because they started fighting for independence. And as a result, Russia stopped supporting them economically. And the trade between Russia and Moldova kind of broke up. And as a result, all of a sudden, like from very organized, safe society, it was total mess. It was unsafe to go out after 5. Even basic things you cannot find in the store. People were without jobs and in masses, because lots and lots of factories that were kind of building things in collaboration with kind of Russian counterparts in Russia stopped working. So it was really amazing. Within a few months, a society that was functioning became totally non-functional society, and everybody were leaving. So the Jews were going to Israel, to the United States. Russians were going to the main Russia. Ukrainians were going to Ukraine. So it was, I remember I had this phone book, and I would cross if the person is kind of out of reach, because it was a physical phone. And all of a sudden, my book became like cross after cross after cross. And within very short time, everything changed around us. And I originally, when my parents started talking to me, it was all my family already moved to Israel, all the other big family. I was very sad, and, I had friends, and, I got used, and I loved Kishinev. But at some point, it really was a new world. It's like you're staying in your own city, but it doesn't feel anymore like your own city. So I guess it helped with the transition to the next step.
Earlier, you mentioned the typical timeline expected of someone like you would be that you study well and then you get married. How did you mentally take that? Did you think, yeah, that might be a fine future for me? Or did you think, no, I definitely do not want that future. I'm going to work hard to prevent that from happening. What was your mental approach to that?
No, I don't know if there's anything wrong with getting married. But the point is that this was a place where, your career option, forget for a second the marriage, but your career option, what you can do. If I would have stayed there, I would be a math teacher, or maybe I would be some, kind of engineer in some institute or something like this. The number of things that I could have done was extremely limited. People, of course, were doing their job and were very solid about this job. But, I knew that, being a Jew, my likelihood to ever be a scientist was close to zero. I wasn't even considering it as a career. You kind of grew up and, that's what I can get. And I will try to optimize within this set of opportunities. That's how I thought about it.
This is the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast interview with Regina Barzilay, professor at MIT, and immigrant from Moldova and Israel. So moving forward in your timeline, around age 20, around 1990, your family moved from Moldova to Israel. This was around the time, as you mentioned earlier, that the USSR was breaking up and living in Moldova was very, very difficult. And also it was around the time that Moldova declared its independence as a republic independent of USSR. What were the conversations like in your family before making the decision to move? Or was it fairly natural just because everyone else, all your other extended family has moved? It's a natural thing.
So everybody moved. We were the last one. Everybody were moving. And also at the time, so we kind of decided we are moving, but then this war with Israel and Iraq started. If you remember, Saddam Hussein at the time threw some rocket into Israel.
Yes.
So there was all this mess. So we lived on the kind of empty house with everything else somewhere for months and months. And I didn't know when we actually can move to Israel. So it was this kind of situation that you are in, that you're not really in one place and not in another place. You are in between places. It continued for some time, and then eventually we moved. And I don't really, remember my thought process. I just remember this waiting, because you really don't know what's to come next.
Yeah, sounds like the family was in limbo for a while. You had packed up everything from your old home. You were ready to move to Israel, but then you were kind of stuck in the middle waiting for things to stabilize in Israel.
Yeah. And the worst part of it, the situation in Moldova was becoming actually worse and worse every day. But it wasn't, it's interesting that when I'm like remembering my time there's some periods which I really remember in greatest detail, but that period I kind of remember a gray period and living in an empty house.
So at that time, I presume you had already finished high schooling. What was your educational status at that time?
So I finished high school and I did, I think, 1 year in the university. I was studying math. I did 1 year in the university. And then, when we kind of declared that we are moving, I had to withdraw from university, and we were sitting and waiting until I can actually move.
So the university in Moldova that you went to, what was the admission process to that? Was there an entrance exam, or was it just based on school grades?
So you need to do several entrance exams to get in. And it was, some of these exams were written, some of them were oral exams. And I got a gold medal. Gold medal means that you get, 5, which was the highest score in all the subjects. And if you get it all in an external examination, then you can actually get into the university if you get 5 on your first entrance exam. So you don't need to do 3 if you have this gold medal and you have the first entrance exam with number 5, then you are in. And the assumption was that if you're doing the oral exam, it's much easier to kind of kill you because you are Jew. So you really need to make sure that you're passing the written exam with full grade. And that's what I did. And it was very, very stressful to make sure that I do get this full grade.
So you knew that one particular kind of exam, the oral exam, would be much harder for you because of your ethnicity and because of your being Jewish. And so you had to excel in one, and that created some amount of pressure.
Yeah, and got this gold medal, which was like an obsession from early age, because this gold medal is actually sort of your entrance to the university.
Right.
I mean, there were lots of universities and a kind of institution of higher learning. Some of them were really not great, so you could get somewhere. But if you want to select where you want to go, at least to some extent, you really have to get, this gold medal was helping. So that's why I was really working very hard to get it.
So moving forward into your first immigration from Moldova to Israel, your entire family moves over successfully. What do you remember about those first few months in Israel?
So it was, it was really beautiful. It was so very different from Moldova because it was like sunny. The buildings were very different because like in Moldova, at least in Chisinau, because it was all, planned by all this, communist government. It was very well organized, the structure and so on, Israel has a lot of flavor of kind of crazy Middle East. So it's like all these different buildings and, like food. People sell it on the street, very, very different. And it was really exciting. I found a lot. I love plants, so I found a lot of plants that I didn't see, that were, there was these different smells and different colors, and people looked very different, because I grew up with an idea, because where I grew up, the Jewish people look kind of similar to how I look, but in Israel there was a whole mix. There were Jewish people like from Morocco and from India, and they just look very different. There were a lot of diversity. There were totally different smells. So it was really exciting, and exciting and scary.
Scary?
No, scary not in a sense. I mean, it was very peaceful times. When we arrived, it was a time that I think, like 1 million people, not Russians, I mean, I'm not Russian, but people from USSR moved within like 2 years or something to Israel. At the time, it was pretty tough, because even with a desire to help, you have such a huge influx in the population, and it was really not clear to me how, we are going to survive economically. I came from a family which was, upper middle class family, and, I never really thought very hard how my parents, how the money comes, and all of a sudden you're really starting in the very, very bottom. It's scary. And also I still remember, there were people on the street, who came, from somewhere from USSR, who were like playing music, and it's clear that it's classically trained musicians, or, there were a lot of people who really would take any job that will pay the bills. And in some ways it's fine, of course we all need jobs, but it was such a humongous shift, and people, all these newcomers, on one hand, were very different from the native population. On the other hand, they tried to get into the society, and it wasn't an easy entrance.
Did your parents have an easy or difficult time finding new jobs in Israel?
Yeah, so my parents actually had very tough, like everybody else. So, my parents came after they were 40s, and at that time, the likelihood that you're going to work based on your, profession was close to zero, unless you have some connection or something like this. And I remember we found an apartment, in some city near Tel Aviv, and my father found a job. Like everybody feel we have to find something so we can, we can pay the bills. And my father went to work in the gas station, and he actually worked on this gas station, I think, for 12 years. Working 12 hours a day, because every penny that will he can bring, he will do it. And my mom, eventually we kind of found her job to be I helped her. I went with her, a cashier in a supermarket, in a fancy supermarket, and she also worked there until her retirement. But they found these jobs, and I went, when we arrived, I went to be in a kibbutz. Kibbutz, it's like a collective agricultural, commune where people, live together. They don't only do agriculture, they may have some small businesses. So I went to the north on my own after like a few weeks after we arrived. And I pretty much stayed there for several months until I learned Hebrew.
Yeah, I was going to ask about language, because you grew up speaking Russian and Moldavian, and here was language an issue. And I think you said that you learned Hebrew kind of in the kibbutz itself.
Yeah, so the kibbutz had these programs that you come and you get like a room in a dorm, and they feed you. That is like a general communal place where everybody eat, like both natives and people like us who were guests or visitors. And we were doing like half a day work, and then there will be few hours of studying Hebrew. So on one hand, you are speaking Hebrew at your workplace because you are part of the general group of people that speak Hebrew, and also you do some study in the class. So within like 2 months, I was pretty fine. I could speak pretty well.
Yeah. So moving forward to your university, I presume that at this point you're still thinking, okay, I did 1 year of university in Moldavia. I need to restart that. Was that your thinking in going to the Ben Gurion University?
It was clear to me that I'm going to go. Like, this was the first thing. I knew that it is like a temporary thing that I do. I was doing variety of things in that kibbutz, like collecting almonds, or I was, assembling like electronic boards, variety, whatever is needed. They put you do the work. And then but I got into the university, and I didn't have money to apply to many, so I applied just to 2 universities, to Ben Gurion, which is in the south, and to Tel Aviv. And I got to both. And, I at the time didn't even know that, that Tel Aviv is considered academically better than Ben Gurion, but I went to Tel Aviv. And I had 2 thoughts in my mind. The first one, that it looks like super fancy place. And I would not feel comfortable there. And the second one was that if I'm going to be a student in Tel Aviv, I would have to live with my parents because I would need to commute, but it's possible. So that's why I went to Ben Gurion, and I started my schooling. So pretty much within maybe half a year, I was already a student, and I was taking my notes in Hebrew and studying.
That's very interesting that some people, they decide to go to college very close to their parents, and you thought, oh, maybe a farther place is better.
Yeah, I think it's not like necessarily farther from the parents. I first of all, I kind of already felt pretty independent that I went to live in the kibbutz, but also I already lived far away from them. But also, in their apartment, it was like a small apartment, and there was my parents and my grandparents, and there was not even clear that there would be a place for me to sit and study. But on the other hand, I would not feel comfortable ever to use money to rent something on my own. So I just thought, if I go there and live in the dorm, then it's fine.
Let's talk a little bit about the computer science education itself. When was the first computer that you used?
So I didn't actually use computers for real until I came back to Ben Gurion. Isn't it funny, correct? And even when I decided to study, I thought I'm going to study computer science. I'm going to study math, because that's what I did. I thought I'm going to go and study math. And I did my undergrad. I completed my undergrad in math and continue with the same level of thinking about being a teacher. I also did like teaching certificate. And I was working because I needed, to pay my bills. I was also working after, during my second year, I started working as a teacher in high school in kind of area with significant socioeconomic challenges, let's put it this way. So I was a high school teacher there.
I see. This was during your bachelor's or during your master's?
During my bachelor's. Because, obviously I could not have found a job even in Beersheba or in another city because, you need to cover your undergrad. But in that place, there were a lack of teachers. So I was able to go and find, at the end of my undergrad, to go and work there as a teacher. So there was no significant difference in age between me and my students.
Right. And so your first computer, you used it sometime during your bachelor's program?
During my bachelor's degree, I had an exam, I had a class, I remember it was called numerical analysis. And we had to work in the lab because I didn't have a computer at home. So, this was the first time I did MATLAB, and I took this class. And then what happened was I did my, I taught 1 year and I liked it. And then I started teaching the second year. I already graduated, I had a degree, I graduated. And then I realized that actually I don't quite see myself teaching until the end of my biological life. Because it's the same material, so whatever you teach this year, then you teach the same book next year. In Israel, at least at the time, there were clear rules, which materials you can use. So it's not like you can select a book and teach according to whatever you like. There's a textbook, you're teaching based on the textbook. And then I realized, maybe it's not what I want to do at all. It's fine, I don't mind teaching and doing something else, but not just teaching all the time the same stuff. And at the time, I was trying kind of to discover if I can go, because in my university, math and computer science were the same department. And I was actually asking, can I, is it possible for me to study or to take classes or do something in computer science? And they told, because you already graduated with undergrad from our department, you cannot take undergraduate classes, but you can sign up for master in computer science. And that's how I ended up going to masters in computer science. And they told me you can take the same classes that you wanted to take, but you just need to write a thesis. And I said, okay. And it was at the time a small university. And I was looking around and thinking, who will take me to write a thesis? And today we of course advise our students that you need to look at, what kind of papers a professor writes and how are your research interests matched with them. I just remember I liked my teacher in computer architecture, and I really liked him. And I asked him, is it possible that you take me, as your student? And he told me, yeah, but my research is in natural language processing. I said, okay. I had no clue what is natural language processing. I said, okay, why not? And that's how I started doing research.
So that was your first taste of research. You did no research in your bachelor's, but because you wanted to study computer science, you started working with this person.
Forced to do a thesis. That's the beginning. Because before that, I never thought of doing research. Again, I was in this mentality, I'm going to be a teacher, until I tried it. And and at that point, I was pretty much forced to do the thesis because there was no other way for me to study computer science, and that's how I end up selecting natural language processing.
And then you start doing research. Are there elements of the research style or the research work life that immediately speak to you, that immediately attract you?
So the thing that immediately attracted me, and it was very wild time in natural language processing, because it was like 95, 96. So the whole field was really moving from this very heavy symbolic, grammar-based view on language to statistical modeling. So it was more on the still kind of symbolic to more empirical approach to language. And at the time, I remember when we took natural language processing class, which is like nothing close to what we're studying today, there was not even one thing that you can look at and say, it's working. Like today, my son knows what is machine translation, what is question answer, just because he uses it. But there was really nothing. It was kind of like theoretical discipline. And the things that excited me about it, that my advisor gave me this problem text summarization. I didn't know nothing about it, but I started working, and then you start programming, and then you actually can see something coming up. And it was really a very much like exciting feeling that you can take it in any direction, and there is really no constraint. And the only constraint is what, you test your ideas and that you see what comes out, and you have this unlimited freedom, which you don't necessarily have, when you're like doing projects for the class, because there it's clear where you should arrive. But when you're doing research, the field is open and you can push it in any direction. So that's what I really liked about it. I didn't realize that I'm really doing research, but that was my beginning.
And so as you start liking research, is that the time that you start thinking consciously, hey, maybe I want to do a PhD, maybe research is a career for me?
You see, this is funny. I didn't. The reason I ended up going to so I wrote this paper and it was very well received. I went to Madrid to ACL in 97, and it was totally magical. This was again the time when the field was changing, when half of the talks were symbolic and half of the talks were statistical. And I still remember some talks. I remember that room, and it wasn't like, I don't know, a few hundred people, not like thousands like today. And there were some really amazing talks, and they were so thought-provoking and so different. And I also loved Madrid. And I said, wow, this should be really exciting life. You're kind of doing what you want to do, and you can think wild thoughts, and there are all these very interesting research directions. And I really would be excited to learn. And, the world is really large. But I have to tell you that when I went and I gave a talk, what happened to me, I gave a talk in this workshop, I couldn't really speak English. I mean, I can sort of speak English, but I could write English, but I could or read, but my conversational English was on the weaker side. And what I did when I prepared my talk, for every slide, together with my advisor, his name is Michael El-Haddad, together with my advisor, I kind of wrote on every slide what I need to say. It was like real.
The script, yes.
Yeah, so I wrote the script with these physical slides, which I had in my books, and I learned it, I truly learned it by heart, and I would repeat it like 10,000 times to make sure that I'm smooth. So, now, you give so many talks, like tomorrow I'm supposed to give a talk and NCI, I didn't even start putting the slides together. But I spent like days preparing for the talk. At any rate, so I'm arriving to this workshop and I see everybody giving such a fantastic talks. And then I'm standing up and I start, going through my slides. And then in the middle of the presentation, I forget the next word. And I stand, and, everybody look at me and I'm quiet. And it's, maybe they thought that I want just to make a point, but I really got stuck in the middle of the sentence and I couldn't remember what is the next thing to say. And then at some point I decided that I should move forward since I cannot stand there quietly. So I just moved to the next slide where I remember what I need to say and continued my presentation. And this was like, I felt it's horrifying. I felt that everybody thought that I was total moron. But it was not the end. The next thing is that they told me that I have to be on the panel. So I didn't realize what panel exactly means. And then they put me with various researchers who were like senior researchers. I was just a master's student. And you're supposed to speak English on the panel. But luckily, in front of me, there was a man who just couldn't stop talking. He pretty much took the whole panel. And God bless him, I didn't have to speak. So I felt really terrible. I really felt that I'm a failure. I was an embarrassment. And I really, I saw that it was pretty much the end of my academic career. But though I liked it very much, but I thought this is the end.
And how did you cope in the days after that when you have this kind of negative feeling that, hey, what I did here was a complete bust? But really, it's not, right? I mean, I think most of the presentation went fine. How did you mentally cope with that?
Yeah, so, it takes time. Time actually, helps you to address all the problems that you have in life. So, at the time you go out and the only thing that I did, the lesson that I learned, the amount of time that I spend preparing on the talk, for my next talk, I tripled that time. And I actually learned every slide independently. If somebody shows me the slides, I know what to say. Obviously, my English became better when I moved to the States, but this was my main lesson.
You're listening to the interview with Regina Barzilay, professor at MIT and immigrant from Moldova and Israel. This is the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast.
And when I came back to Israel, within I think a month or two, my then husband decided, so he went to Cornell. He was a PhD student at Cornell, and he started there before I was still in Israel. He started at Cornell.
I see.
And then I then at some point I finished my master's, and then I had to go to Ithaca, New York, where, you've been as well. And I was a wife. So I was a wife. And he kind of rented an apartment, which was it's near the airport, which is like far from the city. So I was sitting there the whole day with my own thoughts and thinking what I want to do next. And at some point, so I found a job as a programmer, and I was doing it for a few months, but I realized it's not what I want to do. And then I was approached, I don't remember how it came about, but the advisor of my master's advisor, of Michael El-Haddad, was Professor Kathy McEwen, who worked at Columbia, and we somehow connected. She actually saw this paper. She luckily didn't hear me presenting, but she saw the paper. The paper was kind of getting some traction, and she suggested me to apply to Columbia. And I applied in the middle of the year. I started in Columbia in January 1998. And I just moved there and started my PhD.
That's a very interesting story, a very unusual way of entering the PhD program, because the typical story is do your bachelor's or do your master's and then you apply for a PhD. But you spent this 1 year essentially bored, as you said, right?
Yeah, it was maybe half a year that I was bored. It's
Half
not
a year,
bored. I was working as a programmer, but I was thinking, is
Right.
that what I want to do? And
Right.
I decided it's not what I want to do. And then I moved to New York and started my PhD.
Right.
And you asked me earlier the question, did I, if I would not end up being in the States, would I decide to do a PhD? I don't know, but it was just happen. I was in a situation and I made a choice.
It's very interesting always that a lot of career decisions are not conscious decisions. They just happen by chance or happen because of other auxiliary things happening in life.
Absolutely. And I'm looking at now I'm doing admissions to MIT PhD program, and I'm reading these amazing people, and I'm thinking, wow, they look so much more brilliant and so much more accomplished than I was at that point of my life. But somehow it worked out, and I started my PhD at Columbia.
So I want to ask a little bit about your experience, to compare your experience of the first immigration from Moldova to Israel and then your second immigration from Israel to US. They were under very different circumstances. And of course, the countries are also very different. Do you feel that the first immigration prepared you for, again, the culture shock that you would face in your second immigration?
I didn't think of it as an immigration because I was planning to go back to Israel, and still my family is in Israel. I'm very connected to Israel, so I cannot really consider that I have dual citizenship, but I'm kind of in between the two countries, which is quite different situation with Moldova that I never visited since we left. But the first immigration, it was really a culture shock. And part of it is because, the country was really flooded with these new immigrants, which were poor, which looked very different, which, didn't have kind of the polish of, people from more Western society. And, it's kind of bizarre to think, but there were a lot of people, on one hand, there were a lot of people who helped, like really helped. And I still remember there was a neighbor living near my parents' house. When I visited him on the weekend, I had to write some very long paper in Hebrew. And I just came and asked the lady who lived nearby to help me, to make sure that I write, in the right language. And she helped. She just sat with me and helped when I, with the paper. People helped in many, many ways. But when I came to the States, I came in a different class. I came as, educated person who, whose at least husband is in PhD. I was going to PhD. It's all different things. When we went to Israel, I was in the very bottom of, kind of social, hierarchy. In a sense, people would, can say to you something because you're Russian, which was kind of funny because I wasn't Russian, but, you're Russian. People will make jokes about your accent, and this would be all the time. You will be considered kind of some non-refined person. And, one story that I remember, and I cannot leave it from my memory to this day, that I went to visit with my then husband, some friends of his who were from very educated family. And when we were chatting, a really beautiful house and a lot of books. And I took the newspaper, which was like New York Times. It wasn't New York Times. It was the Israeli newspaper. And it had the culture supplement. And I started reading it. At the time, I already, was doing my master's. I was a teacher. So my Hebrew was, pretty reasonable. And then the mother of his friend, who was a very nice woman, came to me and said, "Wow, Regina, I cannot believe it that you're reading it." I said, "Why?" So it's about culture. Like the expectation is that you would not even look at, people kind of discount you because of, how you look like or because of your class. I didn't feel it in the United States at all. And this was the hardest piece to cope, because you are always in somewhat, diminishing role, and you need to prove yourself that you
Right.
are like others. And I think that in some ways, in the United States, at least, that's how I perceive it, there is not much pressure that you forget who you are and you're going to be all part of the same. That there is like Chinatown, and people in Chinatown can, speak their language, have their shops. Well, in Israel, due to the fact how the country was built, that, if everybody will stay the same, then there will be no nationality. There is this push to kind of be like Israeli. And I didn't feel it when I came to the US. I felt I could totally stay the same. Though there were some really funny parts that, but at this point, I just laugh at them. I don't feel in any way, bad about them. And the funniest story that happened to me was I went with one of the faculty. We went to a conference in LA, and we went to pick up, we wanted to take a cab to the hotel. So I went and asked the person in the information in the airport, where the taxis are. And that person started talking to me, and he talks very, very slowly, one word a minute. And, I am trying, and then my partner who was with me, this professor, he kind of interrupted and said, no, just tell me. And then the guy starts to speaking normally. And I felt, wow, he's really rude interrupting, because maybe the person has a disability. But then the person started, speaking totally okay. And it's like, what happened? And the guy, because I have an accent so that I cannot understand normal English. When I was like 15 years professor at MIT. And the book that really resonates with me, and when I read it, it was like as if, somebody wrote parts of my life, is a book, Americana, by Ngozi, which describes, this experience when you are immigrant, but you're an educated immigrant. And she describes it as like a story in the book, which is very parallel to it, that when she entered some college, the heroine of that book comes and tries to talk to admission officers, and they also talk to her in a very slow and bizarre way, until she realizes that they actually talk normally to all the other people in the queue. So there are these funny things, but I never took them very personally.
Yeah, it's very interesting always thinking of the assumptions and prejudices that others have about immigrants. And I think that's where a lot of this comes from. Along similar lines, I want to ask you a little bit about being a woman in the computing or in the math field. I mean, as you know, in computing here and in math here, the fraction of women is very small in the US. What was it like in Moldova and then also in Israel?
So actually in Moldova, it's part of these tales that you believe with, but they kind of that men and women are equal, even though, when you look at the Communist Party, even today, it's not exactly equal when you look at many forms. But we grew up with an idea that, there was no misconception that women wasn't men in math. In fact, in my class, the girls were doing better. And in Israel, somehow, in computer science, I would not say it was half and a half. It wasn't. But again, there was no perception ever that, I'm in some ways inferior to the guys in my class. I started hearing it when I actually arrived to the States, that there are different, that there are differences, and, you should be, there are all these preconceptions that exist. So I don't think that it really impacted me in terms of like my development in computer science. I think I get all the support and benefit that I could from the society that really helped me. So I would say I didn't experience it, as a young scientist. Maybe in some ways I started experiencing actually later in my research career rather than when I was younger.
How was that?
Like I realized maybe, it's a combination of being an immigrant and a woman and outspoken, it's many things. So, in certain places where you just need to convince people to, like, let's say you're trying to push some agenda in a meeting, which you believe is the correct one. In some places, so you're talking to some funders. And in some places, it's like a known bias, correct? We kind of can understand better people which are like us. This is our, inherent bias, and we need to work against this bias. But, sometimes I feel because I'm so different from them in everything, in how I speak and how I think, either I need to try to adjust and understand better how they're thinking, which is a good thing, you're adjusting. Or in some places to say it's fine, I cannot play by their rules. I'm going to lose in some places, but it's okay.
Going back a little bit to my question, the other aspect of it I was trying to ask is, were the fraction of women that you saw in Israel in computing and math, was it different? Was it higher, lower than the fraction you saw in the US and also Moldavia as well?
I never actually thought about this question very much. Like, there were women in my immediate capacity, in my immediate environment when I studied in my undergrad and in my master's, and I did homeworks with them. I never perceived this kind of unique thing. There were enough of them. And when I came to MIT, there were two other women who started with me, which is Professor Dina Katabi, who is another amazing immigrant, and Asos Daglar, who is now the head of our department, who is also an immigrant. And Dina, we were on computer science side. It was Dina and me. Asos is electrical engineering. And it was really helpful to have a peer, which is in your academic age, that we kind of went through the tenure time and kind of building our research group. So this was really of tremendous help.
This is the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast interview with Regina Barzilay, professor at MIT and immigrant from Moldova and Israel. So moving forward in the timeline, I want to ask a little bit about your experience in around 2014 when you were diagnosed with breast cancer. The diagnosis for any kind of cancer is usually a very slow-moving process with many tests over a long period of time. You usually never know, okay, this is it. It's usually, okay, let's try the next test. How did you mentally react to that at that stage in your career where you're already tenured, you already have a research group, and you already have a family, but mentally, how did you react to that?
So this was like the biggest shock of my life because I was healthy. The only time I was in the hospital is when I gave birth to my son. And I couldn't believe it because they always say it's 1 in 8, but you always think that you are the 7th one because I never had any cancer in my family. And, I did mammogram. They told me go do the mammogram. I did the mammogram, but, I never expected that we were going to hear something different. So I still remember, I I did several mammograms. And then on the third year of doing mammograms, I remember I went to Mount Auburn. This is a hospital. It's funny because Mount Auburn is both a hospital and the cemetery at Cambridge. So you need to qualify. It's a hospital. They're close to each other. It was a hospital. So I went there. And I remember they sort of told me, you have something, let's just in case go and do biopsy. And I said, okay. And I was really stressed. It was like tremendously stressful. And I don't think that I actually ever seen anybody who, and it's not true. I've seen some people, but I've seen some people, not very close people, but I've seen people. And it was very stressful. Then I did one biopsy. It was the end of April. And I pretty much knew what will be fully my course of treatment by the end of July. So there was something in the middle, but like by the end of July, I knew I'm going to have chemo, and I started my chemo. But until then, I didn't know. So I It was really bizarre times. It was on one hand, I go through all this medical tests. I didn't say anything to my students because, I would tell them when I know what's going
Right.
on, but I didn't know what's going on. And one of my students won Best Paper Award in ACL during the time, and and they're so happy, and it's like,
Yeah.
who cares? But I try to be nice, and I showed my excitement, and then you just go. The hardest part is actually when you don't know, because once you have like physical pains and
Right.
stuff, but at least the course is clear.
And so at any point, did you think that um, well, maybe I only have a few years left, or was the course of the treatment clear to you from the diagnosis point?
So you really don't know. You really don't know. Like at the moment that you hear the word cancer, you hear this is the end, and you stop believing the doctor because what is your chance? Your chance is tiny, and all of a sudden they tell you have it and say it's 99% that you're fine. What exactly does it mean? I was at
Right.
tiny percent. So you stop believing the numbers. You forget probability as applied to you, and you always expect the worst. And like first it's like there are periods. There is a period when you try to understand what exactly do you have, because it take a while. You need to do some lumpectomy, they analyze it, whatever. It takes a
Right.
while. So you
Right.
kind of leave to the next test, to the result of next test. Then when that part is done, when the real serious chemo starts, you are really in a messed up state. I think in the following way, because you don't know what's to come on one hand. On the other hand, usual life, as when you just go to work and you do your stuff and you go back, is sort of messed up. But the treatment in some ways kind of consuming, that you at the end you just need to do one day at a time, and that's what you do. You do one day at a time.
So there are many researchers and industry professionals who are cancer survivors, and as you said earlier, there is no manual for how to deal with this. Are there things you learned through your experience, things that you did right or things that you didn't do, that you would recommend our listeners if they ever have to face such a situation?
I don't think that there is a universal advice, because people deal with these situations in a very different way. And I think I was really, for better or for worse, I was already, in 43 when I got it. And I feel, this experience extremely matured me. And maybe, the listeners are much more mature than me at age 43. It really changed my understanding and perception of the world. And there is a period when you feel it very acutely, as again, time is a healer. When time goes by, things change, but there are still, a lot of parts that, it just changes how you look at the rest of your life after, after going through this experience. And, and the part that, you kind of discover there is this other world, because when we are living in academia, we are totally stressed. Or is the paper getting in? Or did I get this grant? Or did my student get this job or didn't get the job, or whatever? This is really, really important. And you need to be really serious about it, correct? To really push the boundaries and really think very hard about the problems. And in some ways, I think I would say I wouldn't say we, I would say I, infantile, because, you live in this kind of artificial world where a lot of real problems of real people are really never enter your life, because you have a very organized life. Of course, there is a stress in papers and when you become a patient, you all of a sudden see a different reality. You go, these treatments like radiation and other, happens every day. You see these people, you see a lot of sick people. You're like, how come I didn't know that these communities exist? I was not aware, the suffering and how it impacts people and how fragile we are. So this was my big eye-opening when I went through this treatment. And it's funny because MIT and MGH are just, it's a, 15 minutes walk, one subway stop away, but such a different world.
Yeah, certainly your experience changed the kinds of research problems that you work on, your work with MIT Jameel Center and your other work that is about oncology. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that work that you've been doing recently?
Yeah, so actually, when I came back, I really kind of, it was rethinking, you coming back to the world, your hair starts growing back, but it takes much longer to actually become your normal self. And I started asking myself, how come I'm doing this stuff? And like one of the topics that I really like is working on undeciphered languages, which doesn't have any practical meaning whatsoever, but it's really, intellectually extremely interesting task. And I did some work. I really enjoy reading about it. And I was thinking, what is my right to work on this when there are lots of people who, don't benefit from technology, and you discover how much technology doesn't enter this world when you're part of that world, because you can't imagine even the simplest question that you want to ask. Tell me what happened to the patients like me in this hospital. They can give you some general statistics, but if you want to ask if women of this age with this particular, what happened? Even the information is electronic medical record, like what's the problem? People cannot do even that. So there are a lot of things that they cannot do that they should be doing. And many times you as a patient, you say, oh, you can do A or you can do B. It's up to you to decide. But how can you decide if you don't have the information to make the decision, correct? And at that point, when I came back, I felt, it's like I was not interested in NLP. I still had a group but my mind was like, what can I do to change it? It was like I went through it. I have a mandate. I have to change it. And then I started going around and around these places and asking different doctors, what can I do? And typically, being, a professor, you kind of, you're like a prima donna. You come, thank you so much that you want to work with me. Here I'm going, knocking on all the doors and nobody cares. And it's like, we're doing great. Thank you very much. And it took me a while until I found, what I can do to make, to what I felt to make a difference. And since then, I pretty much changed the whole direction of my research, because it's not only about like taking the tools that we've developed and applying it to medical data. You really need to have absolutely new machine learning algorithms to solve the real problems, not just to do something. You can do something. There are a lot of problems that you can solve just by taking what is out there and applying it. But there are like millions of problems for which we don't have a good computational solutions. And, and the longer I am in it, the more I see these big issues.
It's very interesting. Changing a research area is always tough, and changing one to a very applied research area is even tougher. And as you said, you went and knocked on many doors before you finally came to, I guess, a set of problems you wanted to work on and a set of people who would work with you. I guess the takeaway for me is to be persistent from your experience.
No, I want to correct you. What I actually thought to myself, and that's why I never worked on clinical NLP or whatever, because I thought it's like apply thing. It's like people who cannot, it was really obnoxious of me to think so. I said people who cannot really compete on the methods in NLP, they just take an existing tool in NLP and apply it to medical records and get some paper. This is not the case. Okay, you can do it and you can even get out something, but like if you're thinking like in 2017, one of the topics that I studied I studied in 16, but in 17 there was the first paper. Tommy Yakala and I and our students at MIT, we started working on modeling small molecules, and this area was really not part of kind of core machine learning. We know that in machine learning, there are methods, there is natural language processing, there is computer vision. There was even, sequencing stuff. But modeling the molecules and their properties and other things, it wasn't there. I had to beg my students to work on it because they said, it's not really machine learning. And since then, this field really grew, and there is a lot of new methods work. How do you represent correctly the molecules? Is graph convolution is the right way to go. We've seen the amazing advancement that happened on the on the protein modeling. So this is a very, very active field that really changes. Super exciting field, and it's not. I mean, it has an application, but research itself in this field is actually very much methods driven. And in this case, the reason I think I could jump into it relatively easy because the field didn't really exist at the time. This was the similarity with NLP, that when I entered NLP, it was at the moment of the transition. So it happened to be that in chemistry slash drug design with deep learning, this was a field that was really on the earliest stages. And I actually, when I started working with it, I didn't even connect it to the drugs, because I was in this exploratory stage. I said, I don't know what I want to do. And Professor Klaus Jensen, who is a professor in chemical engineering, approached me. He was introduced to me by my then department head, Silvio Michali, who is a Turing Award winner. He introduced me to him because I just needed some machine learning person on their DARPA grant related to how to do retrosynthesis, which means to identify the path of generating molecule. And I thought, okay, why not? I will try. And when I started talking and looking what is available, Tommy, who from the beginning worked with me and was a collaborator on the grant, we realized it's really a humongous opportunity here in terms of algorithms, and maybe doing it for a year or two. I look from my window, and now I see, from my window, I see Amgen, I see Novartis, I see Moderna from a window from MIT. And I said, why wouldn't we connect it to actually drugs? There was a connection. Because I was working on imaging and predicting cancer from mammograms and other things, but then I realized it's also a potential to do it for therapeutics. And that's how we, kind of pivoted this work into the therapeutic area. So, when I'm looking at this path, it was kind of really non-direct path. When I committed to work on, on cancer, I thought cancer is, NLP extraction from medical record. It's, deep learning from images to predict, progression of the disease or to predict who is going to get the disease. I didn't even connect this work. It took me 2 years to connect it. But now this is kind of most of what I'm doing today.
That's amazing that you've been able to convert that motivation into really, really useful research program. You're listening to the interview with Regina Barzilay, professor at MIT and immigrant from Moldova and Israel. This is the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast. That brings us to the last segment of the interview, which is retrospective and perspective. Let me start by asking what your philosophy is on handling failures and handling rejection, something that all of us academics deal with and everyone in life deals with, and I'm sure you've had your share of that as well.
Oh, absolutely. And actually converting to this new area was just a spectacular list of failures. For the first failure I already described, when I'm trying to collaborate and nobody wants to collaborate at all. This was the beginning. And, and as I say, you need to kiss 100 frogs to find one prince. So to me, it took 1,000 to find one collaborator. This is number one. Number two is, when I submitted my grants to NCI, I never had problem with funding. Before, you go through NSF, we all go room to submit the grants. We know how to obtain money to support our research programs. So I kind of wrote the grant to NCI, and I had a very clear idea what I want to do. Machine learning was not a big part of it at the time. And I wrote to them, I'm a breast cancer survivor. I work with these doctors and I really understand what needs to be done. It's not there. It would help patients. And they wrote, I think, a reasonable grant. Got rejected. Actually, I wrote two. Both got rejected. So I didn't have money to do research that I needed. The students with whom we build all the mammogram works that is now deployed in so many places in the world was done by my student Adam Yala, who is really an amazing student because he was an undergraduate and he believed in me. I didn't even have money to pay PhD students to do this work. So he was working with me, from the small money that you pay undergraduate researchers until he became PhD student. But, so all the grants are rejected. The papers that we started submitting, they're all rejected. when I am trying to obtain the data and I'm talking to people, like none, it's like, they would be polite, but it's rejected. And and at some point, you felt so low that I realized, and also, I constantly, what I did, I just couldn't accept it. So because I knew I have to get the data, I have to get the money, I have to get the students. So I just gave hundreds and hundreds of talks. I would just, at the time we could travel. So I would spend, like a singer on the road. I would have the suit or the dress and I would go places to places and, talk and show my own mom and say, we have to have it. And, I did so many things that, I'm just thinking it's like really tiresome to think of those years. And then and then things started moving. So I don't know what was that point when all of a sudden things started moving, but they started moving at some point. At some point, we did get access to data, and I got some small funding, and these things unrolled. But what I'm trying to say that at that point, there was so much failure when I felt that I have a mission to do, that I stopped taking this failure as something that is wrong with me. Like at some point, I realized it cannot be me. It is an outside world, so it's fine. It just will take more energy. So to me, the failure is how much energy you need to put to change it. And going through that period, I really kind of separated, the failure from my self-perception. It was nothing to do with me. It has to do with, this organization that don't understand. And I just need to put more time.
That's a beautiful quote that you just said. The failure is an inability to understand how much effort you need to put to change the thing. I think that's very well put. Sort of relatedly, I want to ask about imposter syndrome. Many researchers suffer from imposter syndrome where they feel like a fraud. Sometimes it's acute, sometimes it's chronic. How do you advise your students and other junior colleagues to deal with the imposter syndrome?
So again, I think that maybe it's an age, or maybe it's like this change in my career. So the way when I was younger, I did feel it many times. And I remember when I came to MIT, I knew that Shannon was a professor here, which is scary. It's like, wow, are they all like Shannon here? I'm definitely not Shannon. There were all these questions, do I belong to this institution? But I think that what happened like later to me, it's like I am now thinking I have goals, okay? So I have goals. I know what I want to achieve. So my point is, I am what I am now, correct? I really care to get where I want to get. And I am just a vehicle to bring, to bring the group to this particular point. Like, for instance, we have a lot of diseases like cancer, so there is really no treatment. That they're lethal, and despite all the big words that we are saying about AI and healthcare, we really didn't change anything in terms of mortality outcomes and drugs. So there are several areas where I think I have some ideas, my students have some ideas that we believe we can change it. So that what really occupies my mind, how I can make a difference there. It's, who cares if I am smart or not smart? This is irrelevant. My thinking is, would we be able to push it through? So again, but it came with an age and the purpose.
That's such an interesting philosophy, thinking of oneself as a vehicle for a certain kind of research or a certain kind of work to succeed. That philosophy kind of removes the I out of the situation, and essentially it addresses the imposter syndrome, but also addresses other things, and it gives the persistence and the energy to keep moving forward. It's a very interesting philosophy. The next question I want to ask is a little bit hypothetical, but I'll ask it anyway. So you grew up a little bit in Moldova and then a little bit in Israel, and then finally you immigrated to the US. Did you ever think that, hey, if I had grown up in one country, maybe if I'd grown up completely in the US, all else being equal, me being the same person, maybe my life and career may have been very different? Or if I'd grown up completely in Israel from when I was a child, my life and career may have been different. Is this something that you ever thought of?
I don't think about that, but what I do think about sometimes is like, I think I was very privileged that I've seen so many different people in different countries and different attitudes, and they definitely all shaped my understanding of the world and helped me to be robust, in all these different situations. But the part that I am sort of lacking, I feel that, there are big parts of my life that's how we started our interview, that, Kishinev lives in my head. It doesn't look like what is in my head for decades already. And there are parts that are totally remote. I do not, I cannot go to the school where I studied. I cannot connect to the people with whom I grew up. And that's what I really miss. I'm always wondering, how are they doing? And I remember some gardens that I really loved. I'm always thinking, how are these gardens? There is this feeling of something, this nostalgic feeling that I have in me. But on the other hand, I'm thinking that somebody who even grew up in Boston, Boston doesn't look today what it was in 70s. So this is what I miss. And I also sometimes, think that people who grew up in one place, they can connect to the place in a very different way than those of us who are replanted to these places. And, and I was always wondering, how is it if you're really grounded in your environment and you have all these connections and you know exactly, what this person was doing 10 years ago, which I typically don't. So, but it's just, one of the pathways that could have happened. So.
Do you feel that if you had grown up completely in the US, your life and career may have been different than what it is? All else being equal, you being the same person, having gone through the same experiences otherwise.
I don't know, because I'm looking at my career, even, being an MIT professor, what will be the likelihood that, doing NLP, being, running the group in NLP, I will jump into totally different area and do something so very distinct from what I was doing in my PhD. And I remember there were people, I've seen them when I was like a young professor. I've seen there were some people who started in area 1 and then moved to area 2. And it's like, what's wrong with this person? They are really specializing it. Why would they go somewhere else? And, the only thing that I kind of realized, we really never know where the path will bring us if we don't. And, you can as well ride the wave.
Thank you. Thank you, Regina, for your time and your energy and your effort in coming on this podcast and for sharing your journey and your story and your experiences and your thoughts and your philosophies with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
This was episode 30 of the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast. You've heard the immigration story of Regina Barzilay, professor at MIT, and immigrant from Moldova to Israel and then Israel to the US, a double immigrant. This was the 4th episode in our 4-episode segment on immigrants from Israel. You may also enjoy the lead episode of this Israeli-American immigrants segment of our show, that's episode 27, featuring 3 prominent computer scientists originally from Israel who moved to the US in the 1980s and 1990s. That's episode 27. And also episodes 28 and 29 featuring full interviews with 2 other prominent Israeli-American computer scientists. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes where the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast continues to visit other countries around the world as we talk to distinguished computer scientists who immigrated to the US. As usual, you can find all episodes and detailed episode guides on our website, csimmigrant.org. Again, that's csimmigrant.org. And you can find us and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and basically wherever you get your podcasts. All the music used in episodes of the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast is royalty-free. All voice recordings were performed with and are reproduced with full consent of narrators and participants. You can find music credits on our website. Join the online discussion about this podcast on all major social media, including Twitter and Facebook, with the handle CSImmigrant and hashtag CSImmigrant. And of course, the episode guide is available at our website, csimmigrant.org. This is the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast.